Hiker vanished in Colorado 5 years later. "Helen, you have permission to drink," the doctor whispered. At the words, the skeletal woman, who had been legally dead for 3 years, finally reached for the water. Helen Humes had vanished from a Colorado trail in 2002, leaving behind only a torn backpack strap. For 5 years, her family mourned at an empty grave, while Helen was systematically dismantled in a soundproof cellar by a couple the neighbors called kind. She escaped on bare feet, but the truth she brought back was darker than the mountains that supposedly swallowed her. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, and your support means the world and helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Stick with us until the end, and if this mystery moves you, share your thoughts in the comments and pass it along to a friend. The morning of July 14th, 2002, broke over the Colorado Rockies with a golden clarity that felt almost deceptive. It was the kind of sky that makes you feel invincible, like nothing bad could ever happen in a place so beautiful. Helen Humes arrived at the Maroon Bells trailhead just outside Aspen at 6:47 a.m. She was 21, a graduate student who lived for the thin air and the silent, rugged challenge of the peaks. She pulled her silver Subaru into the gravel lot, the tires crunching softly while the rest of the world was still tucked under their covers. Helen wasn't a casual hiker. She was an elite athlete with thousands of trail miles recorded in her journals. She checked her gear with a rhythmic, practiced precision. Water purification tablets? Check. Emergency whistle? Check. High-calorie protein bars and a topographical map? Check. She tightened the laces of her hiking boots, feeling the familiar pull of the leather against her ankles, and signed the trailhead register with a steady, confident hand. By 10 a.m., she was high above the tree line. The air was crisp, carrying the sharp scent of pine and ancient stone. She sent a quick text to her brother. "Top of the world. Be back for pizza by 5. It was a typical sibling exchange, lighthearted and mundane. But as the sun climbed higher, the atmosphere shifted. A localized mist began to bleed out of the ravines, swallowing the vibrant wildflowers in a gray, damp shroud. Helen didn't panic. She knew these mountains. She decided to take a shortcut through a lesser-known ridge to beat the fog back to the basin. That was the moment the injustice of her story began. Helen didn't lose her footing. She didn't succumb to altitude sickness or a sudden rock slide. As she navigated a narrow pass, she was intercepted by something far more dangerous than the terrain. When 5 p.m. came and went without a sign of the silver Subaru, Charles felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Helen was never late. By midnight, the largest search and rescue operation in the history of Pitkin County was underway. For 7 days, over 100 volunteers, K-9 units, and thermal imaging helicopters combed every inch of the Maroon Bells. They looked in the crevasses, searched the icy depths of Crater Lake, and scaled the jagged leaning tower peaks. On the 8th day, they found the only piece of evidence the mountain would give up: a blue nylon strap, torn violently from Helen's daypack, snagged on a sharp rock overlooking a 200-foot drop. The conclusion was swift and heartbreaking. The official report stated she had likely slipped in the mist and fallen into a deep, inaccessible ravine. In 2004, after 2 years of agonizing silence, a judge signed the papers declaring Helen Humes legally dead. Her family held a memorial service, placing a small granite marker near the trailhead. The world moved on, whispering about the tragedy of the beautiful girl the mountains had swallowed whole. But the mountains hadn't taken her. While her family wept over an empty grave, Helen was 43 miles away, trapped in a reality so dark it defied human comprehension. She was being held in a fortified cellar beneath a farmhouse owned by the Claptons. They weren't monsters from a movie. They were a quiet, elderly couple who frequented the local farmers market and waved at their neighbors. To the outside world, they were harmless. Inside that cellar, they were architects of a systematic destruction. They didn't just want Helen's body. They wanted to erase her identity. The room was soundproofed with heavy layers of industrial foam, leaving Helen in a silence so thick she could hear her own heartbeat. There were no windows, no clocks, and no mercy. The Claptons didn't use typical torture. They used conditioning. For years, Helen was kept in total darkness, punctuated only by the harsh glare of a single overhead bulb when it was time for a lesson. She was forced to ask permission for the most basic human functions: to sit, to stand, to blink, to breathe. If she spoke without being spoken to, the food was taken away. If she moved without approval, the darkness returned for days. Slowly, the elite hiker who had once conquered the Rockies was being dismantled. Her memories of the sun, the wind, and the brother she loved began to feel like hallucinations from a previous life. The injustice was staggering. A brilliant, vibrant woman was being reduced to a ghost in a hole while her captors lived a peaceful suburban life right above her head. The curiosity loop in this story isn't just about where she was, but how she survived the psychological onslaught. How does a person maintain a core of self when every second of their existence is controlled by a sadistic whim? The Claptons had planned to keep her forever, a secret pet in a concrete box. They believed they had broken her completely. They believed the elite hiker was gone, replaced by a shell that lived only to obey. But they underestimated the resilience of a woman who had trained her body to endure the harshest environments on Earth. Even in the depths of that cellar, Helen was practicing. She was counting seconds to track the passage of time. She was mentally mapping every sound she heard through the floorboards, the rumble of a specific truck, the chime of a kitchen clock. She was waiting. Not for a hero, but for a mistake. She knew that even the most meticulous captors eventually grow complacent. She just had to survive long enough to see the lock turn 1 second too late. The search for Helen Humes had long since been filed away in the unsolved deceased cabinets of the local precinct. Charles still visited the trailhead, sitting by the granite marker and staring up at the peaks, wondering which ravine held his sister's remains. He never suspected that she wasn't looking down from the mountains, but looking up at a wooden ceiling, waiting for the day the silence would finally break. The tension of those 5 years was a slow, agonizing crawl, a game of endurance that Helen was determined to win, even as her body withered and her mind began to fracture under the weight of the chains. The first act of her nightmare was over, but the second act, the one that would shock the world and redefine the meaning of survival, was about to begin in a hospital hallway 40 miles away. The automatic sliding doors of St. Mary's Hospital in Grand Junction didn't just open, they hissed, a sharp mechanical sound that cut through the thick, humid silence of an August night in 2007. It was 3:14 a.m., the dead hour when the only things moving are ghosts and the desperate. A figure drifted into the lobby, and for a heartbeat, the night shift receptionist thought she was seeing an apparition. The woman didn't walk, so much as she vibrated. A skeletal frame, draped in rags that might have once been clothes. Her hair was a matted, waist-length shroud of gray and brown, smelling of damp earth and old copper. She didn't approach the desk. She stood 10 feet away, her eyes fixed on a specific tile on the floor, her body swaying in a rhythm that looked like a slow-motion collapse. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, her voice cracking. The woman didn't look up. She didn't blink. She waited. It took 3 minutes of the staff coaxing her before she moved an inch. When she finally reached the desk, she didn't speak. She placed a trembling hand on the laminate surface, and the staff saw the first layer of the horror. Her fingernails were worn down to the quick, and her skin was a translucent, sickly parchment that looked like it had never seen the sun. She wasn't begging for help. She was waiting for a command. Triage was a chaotic blur of whispered questions and frantic checks. When they finally got her into an exam room, the injustice of her condition became a physical presence in the room. Under the harsh, fluorescent lights, the human texture of her 5-year nightmare was laid bare. The nurses gasped when they pulled back the rags. There were deep, silverized ligature scars around her wrists and ankles, permanent grooves worn into the bone from years of heavy iron restraints. But it was her arms that told the most calculated story. 40 systematic cigarette burn marks, perfectly spaced like a macabre tally, 17 on the left, 23 on the right. Each one was a correction from the Claptons, a brand marking a moment she had stepped out of line. She weighed 93 pounds. The elite hiker who could once carry a 40-pound pack up a vertical incline was now so frail that the weight of a hospital blanket seemed to crush her chest. Detective James Rohr arrived at 4:30 a.m., his eyes bloodshot and his coffee cold. He didn't expect much, maybe a local runaway or a victim of a botched robbery. But when he ran the woman's fingerprints through the integrated automated fingerprint identification system, the machine didn't just return a name. It triggered a red flag alert that nearly froze the precinct server. The screen flashed in bold, unforgiving letters: Deceased. Humes. Helen. Case closed 2004. Rohr stared at the screen, then at the skeletal woman through the observation glass. He was looking at a person who had been legally dead for 3 years. The fatality at Crater Lake had been a lie, and the mountain had been a scapegoat for something much more sinister. The curiosity loop tightened as Rohr tried to interview her. This wasn't a normal trauma victim. Helen was conditioned in a way that made the seasoned detective's skin crawl. She sat on the edge of the hospital bed, her spine as straight as a rod, staring at the wall. When a nurse offered her a glass of water, Helen didn't touch it. She looked at the water, then at the nurse, her eyes filled with a desperate, silent plea. She waited for nearly 20 minutes until Dr. Vivian Thornton, a forensic psychologist, realized what was happening. "Helen," the doctor said softly, "you have permission to drink." Only then did the woman's hand dart out, her fingers trembling as she gulped the water like it was the first liquid she'd tasted in years. The gossip among the hospital staff was a low, frantic hum in the hallways. "They found her in the parking lot?" one orderly whispered. "No, she walked out of the scrubland on bare feet," another replied. Both were right. Helen hadn't been dumped by a car. She had exploited a momentary lapse in the Clapton's security, a rusted hinge that didn't catch, a lock that slipped by a fraction of a millimeter. She had crawled through 3 miles of dense, thorny brush and then walked nearly 40 miles on asphalt, her bare feet bleeding and blistered, driven by a primal instinct that the cellar hadn't managed to kill. She had avoided every house, every car, and every person, convinced that anyone she met was an extension of her captors. The escalation of the mystery moved from the hospital to the search for the where. As Helen began to provide fragments of her life in the dark, the details were chillingly mundane. She spoke of the lessons. She spoke of the quiet time that lasted for months. She described the smell of the Clapton's Sunday roast, drifting through the floorboards while she chewed on dry crackers in the dark. The psychological punch landed when she described the mirror game. Every few months, the Claptons would hold a mirror up to her face so she could see how much of her beauty had rotted away, telling her that no one would ever want her back, that her family had forgotten her name. They had turned her own reflection into an enemy. As the dawn light began to bleed through the hospital windows, Rohr looked at the maps. If she walked 40 miles from the east, she came from the direction of the old farming tracks. He started circling properties owned by elderly couples. The injustice of the Claptons' peaceful life was about to be shattered. They were likely sitting in their kitchen right now, drinking tea, and wondering why their project hadn't come back from her escape. They didn't know that the girl from the maroon bells was no longer a ghost. She was a witness, and for the first time in 5 years, she didn't need their permission to tell the truth. The second act was closing, but the real confrontation, the meeting between the girl who died and the family that mourned her, was a storm gathering on the horizon. The reunion was not the cinematic explosion of joy the hospital staff had expected. When Charles Humes walked into room 412, he didn't see the vibrant, sun-kissed sister who used to outrun him on the steep switchbacks of the Continental Divide. He saw a stranger, a skeletal figure sitting on the very edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap with a terrifying, military-like rigidity. The air in the room was heavy, smelling of antiseptic and the faint, lingering scent of the damp earth Helen had carried in her skin. Charles stopped in the doorway, his breath hitching in a jagged sob. "Helen?" he whispered. She didn't move. She didn't cry out his name. Her eyes, sunken and hollow, darted to the nurse, standing by the door. She was waiting for the signal. It wasn't until Dr. Thornton nodded and said, "Helen, you can talk to your brother," that the tension in her shoulders broke by a fraction of an inch. She looked at Charles, her voice a raspy, paper-thin thread of sound that seemed to come from a different century. "Mama?" she asked. It was the only word she could find, a plea for the one person who represented the world before the darkness. The investigation, meanwhile, moved with a grim, relentless speed. Detective Rohr's team tracked the mud on Helen's feet to a specific type of river clay found only on the northern edge of the Uncompahgre Plateau. They found the Clapton farmhouse at 11 a.m. It was a picturesque property with a wraparound porch and a swing set that hadn't been used in years. When the tactical team breached the cellar, they found the physical manifestation of the injustice Helen had endured. The reclamation room was a concrete box containing a single thin mattress, a bucket, and a wall covered in thousands of tally marks, scratched into the paint with a fingernail. But the most haunting find was a shelf of photo albums. The Claptons had taken thousands of pictures of Helen during her 5 years of conditioning, documenting her decline like a scientific experiment. The Claptons were apprehended at a highway rest stop 3 states away. They didn't look like criminals. They looked like grandparents on a road trip. During his interrogation, Arthur Clapton didn't show remorse. He spoke about saving Helen from the vanity of the world, about purifying her through the silence. It was a delusion so deep it made the detectives sick. They hadn't just kidnapped a girl. They had attempted to play God with her soul. The community gossip turned from shock to a simmering, collective rage. People realized they had been buying honey and eggs from a couple who kept a girl in a hole for 1,825 days. The legacy of Helen Humes, however, isn't found in the trial or the headlines. It's found in the quiet, agonizing process of her return. As the weeks turned into months, Helen moved back into her childhood home. But the mountains she once loved now felt like a predatory force. She couldn't look at the maroon bells without seeing the mist that led to her capture. She didn't send gifts, and she didn't tell jokes. The language of her old life was gone, replaced by a cautious, stuttering existence. As the record from her recovery states, she still asks permission to exist. She waits for approval before she eats a meal, before she speaks a sentence, and before she walks from one room to another. Charles moved back from Seattle to be with her, sitting in the same space for hours without demanding a single word. Occasionally, a ghost of the smile she used to have would flicker across her face, barely visible but unmistakably present. It was a sign that the Claptons had failed in their ultimate goal. They had fractured her mind, they had scarred her body, and they had stolen her youth. But they hadn't managed to touch that core of resilience that makes a hiker keep climbing even when the air runs out. Survival is not the same as recovery, and freedom is not the same as healing. Helen is free, yet she is not free. She lives in a world of open doors, but her mind still walks the perimeter of that soundproofed cellar. Her true crime wasn't just the chains. It was the fundamental breaking of a human's trust in the light of day. But as she sits on the porch with Charles, watching the sunset over the peaks she once conquered, she is a testament to the fact that some souls are simply too stubborn to be reclaimed by the dark. Outro. The story of Helen Humes is a haunting reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the hidden darkness that can exist in the most ordinary places. Though scarred, she remains a survivor. If you found this story moving, please like the video and subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries of the human heart and the secrets of the wilderness. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Until next time, stay safe out there. Helen survived 5 years of darkness, but her journey back to the light is just beginning. If you believe in the power of the human spirit to endure the unthinkable, hit that like button and subscribe. Let us know in the comments, what part of Helen's resilience moved you the most? Disclaimer: this program is created for entertainment purposes only. While inspired by reported accounts of missing persons and psychological survival, certain names, characters, locations, and events have been fictionalized or dramatized for narrative effect. This content is not a substitute for professional psychological, medical, or legal advice. If you or someone you know is in a dangerous situation, please contact local law enforcement or a crisis hotline immediately.